My beloved child, do not scroll away from this moment. Pause here, because what you are about to hear carries the weight of something that shifted in the quiet hours of last night, something your soulmate has been holding inside with trembling care, unsure of how to bring it into the light. You may think this message found you by accident, at an ordinary moment, on an ordinary day, but in this fictional spiritual story, heaven has placed a lantern over one hidden scene and is asking you to look closer. Something happened last night. Not the kind of thing that announces itself loudly. Not the kind that everyone around them would have noticed. It happened behind a closed expression, beneath a quiet voice, inside a heart that has been trying to appear stronger than it truly feels. And now your soulmate wants to tell you what happened, because after last night, keeping everything hidden no longer feels possible. There was a moment when they were alone, and the silence around them became almost too honest. Throughout the day they had distracted themselves. They had answered people, moved through conversations, handled responsibilities, smiled when expected, and acted as though nothing deeper was happening. But when night arrived and the noise faded, one thought refused to leave them. You. Not simply your face. Not merely a memory. They began thinking about the meaning of your presence in their life, about the strange way certain emotions return no matter how many times they try to place them aside. They remembered details they thought they had forgotten. A certain expression. A certain feeling. A moment when you seemed distant. Another moment when you seemed closer than they expected. And what unsettled them was not that they remembered you. It was how deeply those memories still affected them. They tried to shake it off at first. They told themselves they were overthinking. They told themselves the night had made them sentimental. They tried to focus on something else, but every distraction seemed to circle back to the same unanswered question: why does this connection still feel unfinished? That question opened a door inside them, and once it opened, other truths began walking through. They started remembering things they never said to you. Words they swallowed because the timing felt wrong. Feelings they disguised because they were afraid of appearing too vulnerable. Questions they wanted to ask but avoided because they were afraid of the answer. Last night, those unspoken things became louder than all the reasons they had used to remain quiet. And this is where the story becomes more intense, because something happened after that first wave of memories. Your soulmate began replaying one particular moment connected to you. It was not necessarily the biggest moment you shared. It may have looked insignificant from the outside. Yet to them, it has remained strangely vivid. They remembered the way they felt afterward, and for the first time they allowed themselves to consider that they may have misunderstood what was happening between you. There had been something in your energy, something in your response, something they interpreted one way because they were protecting themselves. Last night they wondered whether they had been wrong. That realization did not bring immediate relief. It made everything more complicated. Because if they were wrong, then some of the distance that followed may not have been necessary. Some of the silence may have been built on assumptions. Some of the things they told themselves about you may have been incomplete. And suddenly they were not only missing you. They were questioning the story they had created to make sense of the connection. They began asking themselves whether fear had spoken louder than truth. Whether pride had delayed a conversation. Whether uncertainty had been allowed to grow where honesty should have existed. My child, there are moments when people do not run from love because they feel nothing. Sometimes they hesitate because they feel too much and do not know how to carry it. In this story, your soulmate reached one of those moments last night. They could no longer comfortably pretend that everything inside them was settled. Something had moved. Something had cracked open. And once it did, they were forced to look at feelings they had kept carefully arranged behind emotional walls. They thought about reaching out. Their hand came close to the possibility. They imagined what they would say if they stopped protecting every word. They imagined beginning simply, perhaps with your name, perhaps with a question, perhaps with an admission that something had been on their mind. But they froze before taking the final step. Not because they had changed their mind. Because suddenly the importance of the moment became real. What if they said too much? What if you had moved on emotionally? What if you misunderstood their intentions? What if the conversation opened everything again and neither of you knew what to do with it? Yet beneath those fears was another thought, quieter but stronger. What if I remain silent and regret it? That thought changed the atmosphere of the entire night. They sat with it longer than they expected. The more they considered silence, the heavier silence became. The things they had once considered safer suddenly felt costly. Avoiding the truth no longer felt like protection. It felt like postponing something that would eventually demand to be faced. And then your soulmate remembered something about you that made the feeling stronger. They remembered the way you had once shown sincerity without asking for recognition. Maybe it was patience. Maybe it was kindness. Maybe it was the fact that you never forced them to explain themselves before they were ready. Something about the memory made them realize you may have understood far more than they ever gave you credit for. That realization touched them deeply, because it made them question whether you had been waiting for honesty while they were waiting for certainty. And certainty, my child, rarely arrives before courage. Last night, your soulmate began to understand that perhaps they had been asking for a perfect sign before allowing themselves to be emotionally honest. They wanted reassurance before vulnerability. They wanted guarantees before truth. They wanted to know exactly where the road would lead before taking one sincere step toward you. But the heart does not always reveal the destination before movement begins. Sometimes clarity comes only after the first honest conversation. Sometimes what feels like confusion is simply the space between what someone knows privately and what they have not yet dared to say aloud. There was another moment during the night when they became unusually emotional. Not because something terrible happened, but because a simple realization landed harder than expected: time is moving. Life is moving. People change. Circumstances shift. Opportunities do not remain suspended forever. They suddenly understood that the version of you they have been carrying in their mind may not remain available indefinitely. Not because you are threatening to leave, and not because fate is punishing anyone, but because human beings continue growing. You continue learning. You continue becoming. And one day, hesitation can become the very thing that changes a connection. That possibility frightened them more than they wanted to admit. So they began imagining what it would feel like if you truly moved forward without ever knowing what they had wanted to tell you. They imagined hearing that you were happy, transformed, deeply connected to another chapter of your life. Part of them knew they would want that happiness for you. But another part whispered, "Would I always wonder what would have happened if I had spoken?" That question stayed. It stayed while they looked at the time. It stayed when they tried to rest. It stayed when they changed positions, hoping sleep would quiet the mind. It stayed when the room became darker and the world outside grew still. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of trying to push the thought away, they allowed themselves to answer it. Yes. Yes, they would wonder. Yes, they would regret not speaking. Yes, there are things they still want you to know. That admission was the true turning point of last night. Until then, your soulmate had been debating whether the connection mattered enough to disturb the silence. After that moment, the question changed. It became, how do I tell them without losing control of everything I have kept hidden? And there is more. Because what they want to tell you is not simply, I miss you. It is not merely a confession of longing. That would be easier. The deeper truth has layers. They want to explain why they behaved differently than they felt. They want you to understand what was happening inside them during moments when you may have interpreted their distance as indifference. They want to explain something they discovered about themselves after knowing you. Something that made them uncomfortable at first because it exposed a part of them they had spent years avoiding. You awakened a vulnerability they did not expect. In this fictional story, that was one of the reasons everything became complicated. You were not just another person passing through their emotional world. Your presence began reflecting things back to them. Their patterns. Their fears. Their habit of withdrawing when something matters too much. Their tendency to analyze instead of speak. Their desire for closeness fighting against their fear of losing control. They may have thought they were protecting the connection by keeping certain emotions hidden, but last night they finally saw that hiding those emotions may have created the very confusion they were trying to avoid. That insight was difficult. It is easier to believe circumstances caused everything. It is easier to blame timing, distance, misunderstanding, other people, busy schedules, or bad luck. But sometimes a deeper truth waits beneath all those explanations. Last night your soulmate confronted one. They had been emotionally waiting for you to prove something that they had never clearly asked you to prove. And when they realized that, they felt a wave of regret. Not shame. Not despair. Something more tender. The kind of regret that arrives when a person sees that someone else may have been carrying confusion because they themselves were afraid to be transparent. They thought about how you might have interpreted certain moments. They wondered whether you believed they did not care. They wondered whether you thought they had forgotten. They wondered whether you had questioned your own instincts because their actions did not match the energy between you. The thought of that affected them. Because if there is one thing they want to correct now, it is the idea that you imagined everything. They do not want you believing that the connection existed only in your mind. They do not want you thinking every meaningful moment was one-sided. They do not want you assuming their silence meant absence of feeling. But there is a reason they have not said this yet, and this reason matters. Your soulmate has been trying to separate genuine emotion from temporary loneliness. They did not want to come toward you simply because they were having a difficult night. They did not want to confuse missing you with being ready. They did not want to make promises from emotion that they could not sustain in reality. That hesitation, while painful, came from a desire to understand themselves honestly. Last night, however, something became clearer. They realized this was not one lonely night. The thought of you had been returning in different forms for longer than they admitted. Sometimes as curiosity. Sometimes as memory. Sometimes as a strange sense of unfinished conversation. Sometimes as an unexpected warmth when someone mentioned something that reminded them of you. Sometimes as irritation because they did not want to care anymore. Sometimes as peace. Sometimes as longing. Sometimes as the uncomfortable feeling that no matter how much they tried to simplify the connection, something remained unresolved. And last night all those scattered moments suddenly looked like one continuous pattern. That pattern frightened them, but it also gave them clarity. They asked themselves a question they had avoided for a long time: if I truly did not care, why have I spent so much energy trying to convince myself that I do not care? The answer came quickly. Because caring makes everything real. And when something becomes real, choices have consequences. Your soulmate understands that opening this conversation could change the dynamic between you. Once certain truths are spoken, it may become impossible to return to comfortable ambiguity. That is why they have been so hesitant. Ambiguity can be painful, but it allows people to hide. Truth demands movement. Even if the movement is simply toward clarity. Last night they reached the edge of that truth. They began composing words in their mind. Not dramatic words. Not perfect words. Honest ones. They imagined telling you that they had been thinking about you. They imagined admitting that their distance did not tell the whole story. They imagined explaining the fear behind their silence. They imagined telling you that something about last night forced them to see the connection differently. Then they imagined your response. And that is where something extraordinary happened inside them. Instead of imagining rejection first, as they usually might, they imagined you simply listening. That image changed everything. They saw you not as someone waiting to judge them, but as someone who might finally understand what had been hidden. They imagined the relief of no longer carrying the entire emotional story alone. And for the first time in a while, the idea of speaking felt less frightening than the idea of remaining silent. But they still did not send the message. Not yet. Because another truth surfaced immediately after. There is something specific they need to explain about last night itself. Something happened before all of these realizations became intense. Something small on the surface, but powerful enough to trigger everything that followed. It may have been something they saw. Something they heard. Something someone said. Something connected to you that appeared unexpectedly and caused them to stop what they were doing. Whatever it was, it struck a part of them that had been quiet. And heaven, within this story, is drawing your attention to that hidden moment because the meaning was not in the event alone. The meaning was in their reaction. They reacted more strongly than they expected. Their body became still. Their thoughts accelerated. Their emotions rose before logic could organize them. For a few seconds, the protective version of your soulmate disappeared, and the honest version stood there completely exposed. That is when they knew. They knew you still mattered. They knew the connection was not emotionally finished. They knew pretending otherwise was becoming impossible. But what happened next made the night even more significant. Instead of immediately reaching for you, they stepped back and asked themselves why this affected them so deeply. And during that reflection, an old memory returned. A memory connected to something you once said or did that they had misunderstood at the time. Last night, for the first time, they saw that memory from a completely different angle. Suddenly, your behavior made more sense. Suddenly, a silence of yours looked different. Suddenly, something they had once interpreted as distance may have actually been self-protection. And that realization broke open another layer. They began wondering whether you and they had been mirroring each other without knowing it. Both waiting. Both protecting. Both reading silence as rejection. Both wanting reassurance. Both afraid to be the one who cared more visibly. If that is true, then the tragedy was never lack of feeling. It was lack of clarity. My child, this is why the message carries urgency without fear. Not because disaster is approaching, but because understanding has arrived, and understanding creates a window. Your soulmate is standing inside that window now. They can see things they could not see before. They can recognize patterns that once confused them. They can admit emotions they once minimized. But windows do not remain open forever. Not because heaven shuts them cruelly. Because human courage fluctuates. Tonight they may feel brave. Tomorrow they may overthink. In another few days they may retreat again behind routine. That is why something inside them is saying, speak while the truth feels this clear. And what they need you to know is that they are not trying to reopen the past exactly as it was. They understand that whatever existed before cannot simply be copied and continued. Too much has been learned. Too much has shifted. If there is ever a conversation, they know it has to be different. More honest. More grounded. Less dependent on guessing. Less built on hidden expectations. They do not want to return to confusion. They want to understand what is real now. That distinction is important. Because part of your soulmate's fear is that reaching out may make you think they want to repeat an old cycle. They do not. Last night showed them that if they ever approach you, it has to come from a deeper place. A place where truth matters more than ego. A place where they can admit, I did not handle everything perfectly. A place where they can hear your experience without immediately defending their own. And there is one particular thing they may want to apologize for. Not necessarily a single event. An emotional absence. They may want to apologize for leaving you to interpret what they were unwilling to explain. That is a difficult apology because it requires admitting that silence has consequences. They used to believe that saying nothing was neutral. Last night they understood that silence communicates too. When someone cares and receives no explanation, the mind fills the empty space. It creates stories. It questions worth. It wonders what changed. Your soulmate realized they may have left you inside that empty space longer than they intended. And they do not feel good about it. This does not mean they are drowning in guilt. It means they are awakening to responsibility. There is a difference. Guilt says, I am terrible. Responsibility says, I can choose differently. Last night they moved toward the second. They started asking what choosing differently would actually look like. Would it mean sending a simple message? Would it mean waiting until they could speak clearly? Would it mean letting go of pride and admitting they have been affected by you? Would it mean asking a question they have feared hearing answered? They do not have every answer yet. But they do have one. They know they no longer want fear to make every decision. That may sound small, but for someone who has spent a long time protecting themselves, it is enormous. And then, near the end of the night, when exhaustion had softened their defenses, one final thought came through with unusual clarity. They imagined standing in front of you with no performance, no hidden strategy, no attempt to appear unaffected. They imagined simply telling you the truth about what happened inside them last night. And in that imagined conversation, there was one sentence they kept returning to. A sentence they have not said. A sentence that explains why they could not sleep peacefully after everything became clear. A sentence that, if spoken, may change how you understand every quiet moment between you. But before they could decide whether to send it, something else happened. Their attention was pulled toward something they had not expected to see again. Something connected to you. Something they believed was no longer important. And the instant they saw it, they realized the story they had been telling themselves about your connection was missing one final piece. They stared at it. They read it again. And in that moment, the question was no longer whether they should tell you what happened last night. The question became whether they were finally ready to tell you what they discovered about you, about themselves, and about the one hidden truth that changes the meaning of everything that came before.